taking the time. You've been in the solidarity space for such a long time now, and I mean, you've been doing some really hard work on the ground. There's so many different factors to explore, and I know we won't be able to touch on everything today, but hopefully if we can give listeners and viewers the gist of it, and kind of just bring them on track with everything that is happening. I think a good spot to start is the flotilla. Maybe update us on that. What's been happening in terms of the flotilla?
Sure, absolutely. So we are in planning and preparing mode for what should be the largest humanitarian flotilla ever attempted to break the illegal siege on Gaza. The team is looking to bring together 1,000 activists across about 300 boats, and they should leave next month. This flotilla is a little bit different in that we are in the context of what is ultimately a fake ceasefire, but is a different geopolitical context. And so the flotilla is bringing floating hospitals and a lot more solidarity, practical solidarity around rebuilding. So trying to bring doctors, teachers, eco-builders, and the like to attempt to break the illegal siege, bring in needed humanitarian aid, but then aid in the process of rebuilding Gaza alongside those people who have the skills, of course, but lack many of the resources in the current context of an ongoing genocide. So that is what the flotilla is gearing up to do. Something that's really important to note is that 7 Global Samud Flotilla activists were detained in Tunisia recently, and we are currently calling for their release. Tunisia, the Tunisian president ran on a campaign of solidarity with Palestine, and the last flotilla left from the port in Tunisia. It was very meaningful for the South African activists to leave from an African port. So it is very concerning that the Tunisian authorities in particular have detained these activists. It was at a peaceful rally in support of Tunisian solidarity with Palestine that they were detained, and we're calling for their immediate release. And that is the latest.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Madison. I really wanted to just touch base, I think, on what you mentioned right now about the Tunisian authorities holding essentially activists, in terms of calling for their freedom. How can general community members take part in this? Is there a way that they can get involved and show their solidarity and support? How can the general public essentially support the flotilla?
Yeah, in terms of calling for the release of these 7 activists, this is something that we need to be building messaging around in social media spaces, online, talking about on TV, and making sure that people really know, because the message hasn't really gone out at this point. And that's partly because the flotilla is this round of the flotilla is in its early stages. And so there isn't a lot of media eye on what's happening. So building momentum around this story is super important. And then asking our governments to call for the release of these activists. Tunisia is party to many international treaties that South Africa is also party to, as well as United Nations frameworks. So using those mechanisms to call for their release is our greatest asset at this point. But for regular folks, it's talking about it as much as possible, making sure people know that Tunisia, there's something up in Tunisia in terms of what is their role in solidarity with Palestine and how are they going to treat flotilla activists who will be moving through that space no matter what, being along the Mediterranean. So this is a chance to really put pressure on the Tunisian government, but also on the South African government and any states that are party to any international treaties that should be protecting humanitarian activists.
All right. I mean, thank you for sharing that again, Madison. And I'm going to even go into some really tricky territory, both literally and metaphorically speaking. Gaza right now is in an incredibly dire condition, of course, and I mean, I think most news outlets now have somewhat changed their narrative, if they haven't earlier done so, towards a more human rights approach when it comes to Gaza and Palestine in general. And so I want us to move from what's happening in Tunisia with the activists being held quote unquote hostage, if I may say so, by Tunisian authorities to what's happening on the ground in Palestine. For the general public, again, because I really just want to make this digestible for listeners and viewers back home. How do they really conceive this idea now of still fighting for a free Gaza or free Palestine, just given the constant bombardment of the dire news that we're receiving of continuous bombing and evacuations, etc. And what does the ground of Palestine look like now? What is the latest updates that you've been receiving?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to really recognize is that the ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire, is fake. The IDF controls something like 50%, under military control, 50% of Gaza, which means that the population of Gaza is under threat, as they have always been, but also squeezed into small areas. Since the US Israeli illegal attacks on Iran began, they have closed the Rafah border. When we say that Gaza is an open air prison, this is what we mean. People cannot get in or out, as well as humanitarian aid, which is much needed, cannot get in or out via that Rafah border. That Rafah border is closed. And so the people in Gaza are really trapped, which is why the flotilla is such a unique idea, because it uses the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, as a sea corridor to the Gaza Strip, which is, of course, on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The other place to really look at in Palestine right now is what's happening in the West Bank. 36,000 people have been displaced by both state violence as well as settler violence. Whenever eyes are somewhere else, right? The global eyes right now are on this illegal war with Iran. And this is when the IDF and settlers especially like to strike. There have been reports of dozens of people or hundreds of people being arrested, including a recent report of a group of dozens of women being arrested in the West Bank. 36,000 people are displaced. And then Israel is also taking this opportunity to bombard Lebanon. So that is a bombardment of Beirut, which they say is towards Hezbollah. But it's also been a bombardment of southern Lebanon, which we see really as an opportunistic land grab. They are attempting to use the strategy of ethnic cleansing to grab land from southern Lebanon. And then, of course, most people are talking about the closing of Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, and as well as there's been a closing of the church, what is it? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is one of the Christianity's holiest sites. So there is ethnic cleansing in this way of removing people's access to their holiest sites, which is unprecedented, actually, as much as unprecedented means nothing in unprecedented times. So the people are really hurting, and they're really being squeezed. And so it's important to remember that Palestine doesn't just go away when there's other atrocities happening. So to keep focus on the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine as well.
All right. Thank you so much for that update, Madison. More with you after the break. We will discuss coal and South Africa's relationship to Israel and Palestine. All right. Let's take a short break. We'll be back shortly.
Hey, Gulam. Yeah? Did I return your lawnmower last?
Welcome back to the mid-morning talk here at Slam Media. I am Fasiha Davids, your host for today's session. So excited to be here and, just interview our wonderful guest lineup that we have today. We are currently joined by Madison Bannon, movement builder, mother activist in Palestine, solidarity and communications specialist. We've been exploring what's been happening on the ground in Palestine and the latest news around the flotilla. We're going to kind of move now to the relationship between South Africa and Palestine. South Africa is currently the number one coal supplier to Israel. This given that South Africa has also been one of the countries at the forefront of solidarity. I remember, Madison, in our previous interview, I believe in 2025, if I'm not mistaken, you explored kind of this, interesting, very much quote unquote double standard relationship that South Africa kind of may be reproducing in some sense. What is your kind of take on it now from a political standpoint, and what is happening with the coal?
Yeah, thank you, Fasiha. The coal supply is relentless. There is another ship that is scheduled to dock in Richards Bay Coal Terminal called the Genco Courageous. It should be there in 10 days from today. And we have sent 3 million tons of South African coal since October 2023 to Israel, spread over 20 some odd ships. And it is illegal under international law, the international law that we helped establish with the ICJ case. But what happens is the company, specifically, there's a company called Glencore, largest mining company in the world, that has most of its stocks held at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. It has a headquarters in Melrose Arch. They get the coal in from all the different coal suppliers, including African Rainbow Minerals. All those coal suppliers, all those mines poured into one giant bucket. That bucket is sold from Glencore directly to the Israeli electricity company. And so DTIC often says, basically, we don't have control. It's a discrimination clause, etc. We can't just say we're not going to sell coal to certain countries. But it's just preposterous because it's a dual use item. Israel is using that coal for military means, as well as for settler colonial infrastructure, of course. But in the current context, it's even more absurd because not only is that coal fueling genocide and apartheid, it's now fueling a war in Lebanon and in Iran. And so South Africa coal shouldn't be going to Israel. It shouldn't be sold to the Israeli electricity company. And it doesn't need to be. We can find other markets for that coal. We sell coal to lots of other people. We could keep the coal here and keep our lights on through periods of load shedding. Or God forbid, we could keep the coal in the ground and save us all from the climate catastrophe that burning coal is bringing us towards. So that is the current situation with the coal. But there are two streams of resistance that I'd love to tell you about. Now I've been talking for too long. Do you have any other questions on that, Fasiha, before I go into the
thank you. Thank you for the information and you speaking in such an eloquent and fluent manner, Madison. And I really think the listeners and viewers also just appreciating those updates back home. Understanding this matter of coal and the exports, etc., and how it is ultimately fueling the genocide and the war, and you explore that dual standard. You can really just speak to me about what is South Africa's role from an activist perspective, specifically maybe even the BDS coalition, which is boycott, divest, and sanctions, and kind of what role are they playing in terms of trying to assist the Palestine solidarity movement through all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So through BDS, which is Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Campaign, we have regular pickets of Glencore, absolutely. But one of the major things that's happening is that the BDS coalition has prepared a report that they're going to submit to the government on Monday. And this is a factual and legal analysis of the coal exports to Israel and both the South African governments and the ministerial obligations. And it demands urgent action to halt the exports. So that dossier is headed to government, like I said, on Monday. And so you should see hopefully a lot of news stories about that coming out. So we really need to push our government now. The idea is not to, say sue the government or something. The government has shown itself to be an ally of Palestine and an ally of human rights. And so this is an effort to push them towards realizing those rights, realizing their solidarity, and basically putting their money where their mouth is. So that is one stream that's happening from the BDS coalition, the South African BDS coalition, on Monday. And then the other stream of resistance that I'd really love to talk about is there is a documentary film being created right now, and it's called Fueling the Fire. So I invite our audience to head to fuelingthefiredocumentary.co.za to check it out. But it follows Professor Haidar Eid, who is a beloved member of the activist community here in Johannesburg. He and his family are genocide survivors over and over and over again. And he is a BDS founder within Palestine. So that's the BNC. And so it follows his story as well as the mining affected communities of South Africa as they confront Glencore. And the film really works to expose Glencore, largest mining company in the world, who's making the sale directly to the Israeli electricity company, as complicit, not just for being your run-of-the-mill capitalist business that's just interested in its bottom line, but as having direct ties to Israel, and specifically working to fuel genocide and war. So those are the two major things that are happening right now.
All right. I mean, pretty interesting stuff, Madison. And, we're going to be kind of following in terms of both. So it's fuelingthedocumentary.co.za, where Professor Haidar Eid kind of explores, what's been happening in terms of Palestine and the genocide and relating it back to mining affected communities here back home in South Africa. And then also the dossier that you mentioned, which is a legal document being submitted to the South African government to essentially challenge them on the very basis of the ICJ case and other laws that's that are meant to protect the human rights of the Palestinian people, and I mean just of human beings across the globe. This is a very interesting time that we're living in, a weird time to kind of conceptualize and try to make sense of the world, because we're living in a very I would say the time that we're living in just doesn't make sense, right? And so I think it's a very strong moment for members of the community and the general public to kind of lean into local solidarity. And I know that's something that you are quite familiar with, and you have some local solidarity groups. Maybe share with us what you've been doing in terms of local solidarity actions and your local solidarity groups.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think when we say, we say this often, like Palestine will free us all. And if we look at what's happening in the geopolitical context and what looks like, the last violent kicks of a dying horse of empire and imperialism, when empire falls, what will rise behind it? And the work that we are doing in my neighborhood, so I'm part of the Kensington Palestine Solidarity Group, which is locally based around the east side of Johannesburg, Kensington, as well as other neighborhoods, because Kensington it's an ethos, it's an idea, as much as it is a geographic location. And so what we're trying to do here is really pour into our community. What that looked like recently was that we held our first KPSG Iftar. KPSG is a secular organization, it's an activist organization, but we really wanted to come together as a community, an interfaith community, to break bread, break fast, to feed people in our area that need food, but not just to feed them through a charity approach, but to really like sit down beside our community members and have a meal. And so we had hundreds of people there, and it was really a special event. And it kind of exemplifies the community work that I think will be so necessary in rebuilding humanity after such an incredible period of violence and destruction. These are the models: hyperlocal, solidarity, practical solidarity models of reaching, just into your neighbor, reaching into your community, and sitting down and saying, what do we need to take care of one another? So yeah, I think it's a really beautiful model, and that's what we've been doing as KPSG.
All right. I mean, thank you, Madison, for sharing that. And just so grateful to have you as a guest today on Salam Media. I know you are incredibly busy doing the hard work on the ground, and, also just keeping afloat with everything happening internationally and the flotilla as well. And at the backdrop, I think, of your messaging, what we really can leave with listeners and viewers from this interview is this warm idea of inspiring compassion and community building and community strengthening, in the midst of this geopolitical warfare and uncertain times. Thank you so much for joining, Madison. Before I do let you go, where can the public find you? Where can they get hold of you?
I love to say you have to find me at a protest, because I try not to be on the internet.
Right.
But I am personally on LinkedIn, and I do work with environmental organizations as well, through the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and through Mobilize. So those are places to also find me within the climate ecosystem. And then, like I said, on the ground at the next Palestine Solidarity Action, I'm there. I'm there with the best looking sign. That's my claim to fame.
Absolutely amazing, and what a wonderful guest that we've just interviewed. Madison Bannon, movement builder, mother activist in Palestine solidarity and communications specialist. We touched on some really, I would say, difficult and complex topics in terms of what's happening in Palestine, looking at it from a global and hyperlocal perspective today. I think the difficulty, again, lies in the activism in terms of what's happening on the ground and what governments and authorities have been doing internationally, both with the South African coal exports in Israel and the Tunisian authorities holding activists arrested essentially from the flotilla. So again, a lot to explore and a lot to stay up to date with, but you can find Madison online and at the next protest. All right, we're going to move to our next break, and then to our next guest. We are joined by Sheikh Riyad Fattar after the break, exploring the consciousness of Ramadan and the beautiful messages and Q&A that we have received from our community members. We'll